Hello. The topic of discussion for today's discourse is crisis management and communication imperatives. So we'll look at crises of various kinds. There can be man-made crises, there can be natural disasters. When we talk about man-made crises, this includes emergencies which are caused by the mistakes which we commit in factories, at shop floors. It can be a sabotage. And when we talk about natural disasters, it can be thunderstorms, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, winter storms, droughts, wildfire, landslides, earthquake, tsunami, etc. And it's not just the people who are affected by crisis. We find that a lot of non-human agencies are also affected, like animals, pets, and it can be flora and fauna, it can be water bodies. So whenever a disaster strikes, it has to be seen from various perspectives and also with a very transdisciplinary approach. And every disaster crisis has a story. As you all are going to be communicators, it's very important for you to look at disasters from the communication perspective, whether they are man-made or natural caused by error. The best way to prevent a disaster is to understand them. So what really happens when there's a disaster or a crisis? We generally are in a kind of a mood that we do not want to have anything to do with that. And we generally think of a disaster as it has not happened to me, it has not really happened. So we have that kind of an attitude. But if you are heading a company, or if you're in charge of communications, or even as someone who is affected by a crisis, it's very important that first of all, you have to believe that this has happened. Once you believe that this has happened, only then you can solve it. Otherwise, we become part of the problem. There's a saying in English that the character of a man is known in adversity. The same can be said of an organization. How it responds to an emergency, what measures does it take, what resilience does it display, goes a long way in the public perception. One thing is very important when a disaster strikes, the magnitude is very big. The intrusion by the media. There's a saying in the media parlance that good news is no news, bad news is good news. So the media, especially the news media, is looking at things which are extraordinary, which are not normal. So obviously, whether you like it or not, the media is going to knock at you. So let's discuss what is important from a communication perspective in the face of a crisis. The first and foremost thing is that an avid acceptance in the first place that a crisis disaster has happened. Not recognizing a crisis or being detached often results in being a part of the crisis. And especially for those people who are in charge of handling crisis, it can be government, it can be company, it can be a CEO, it can be a communication person. So it's very important that we do not lose reason when we are handling a crisis. So there are 4 phases in managing a disaster: mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. The significance of the emergency management cycle is that all communities are at least in one phase of emergency management at any time. A lot of empirical research tells us that whenever a crisis happens, generally a lot of interest is taken, or a lot of work is done in terms of response and recovery after a disaster has happened. There's a very less kind of interest taken in mitigation and preparedness. Only if we prepare for a disaster, the response and recovery can be much better, which generally does not happen. When we look at the disasters in India, a number of disasters happened. I remember 1999, this super cyclone which happened in Odisha, and later some more crises. Then the government of India decided to have a law on disaster management. So an act was passed in 2005 called the National Disaster Management Act. So under which, there is a National Disaster Management Authority at the center. There are also state management authorities The Prime Minister of India is a chairperson of the National Disaster Management Authority, and this has 9 members. So when we look at the crisis management plan, it's very important that it is always patterned to fit the organization's own potential exposure to a calamity. Just to illustrate, the crisis management plan of a nuclear plant will be very different from that of a steel plant, because the potential risk areas are quite different in the two cases. In times of terrorist strike in a particular city, you must have heard the police generally is put on red alert in other cities, which amounts to gearing up to the immediate possibility of similar strikes in other cities. If there's a natural disaster, obviously, it doesn't generally come with a kind of a prior notice, but thanks to the Met Department now, we can just make out when a certain cyclone or tsunami is on way. When we had the funny, disaster in Orissa, or the Amphan disaster in West Bengal and Orissa in 2020, when the country was locked down due to COVID-19. So people had early signals, the authorities informed the people, and well on time, the people were rescued and put in, those rehabilitation camps. So we found that there weren't many, deaths, and many people who could have been victims of these Amphan cyclone were saved because of early signal of the possible cyclone which was on way. James GRUNIG is he's a living person, one of the very, very important philosopher and author in public relations. So he's come out with 4 principles of handling a crisis, an effective crisis. One is the relationship principle. If an organization can withstand crisis only if it has well-established relationship with its key stakeholders. Just to give you an example which happened in the early part of the current century, when I hope you'd recall that there was a media news about Cadbury chocolates having worms in it. It created huge furore in the entire country. The sales obviously took a dip. Who would like to take chocolates with worms? And the company, it took it about 6 months and a very effective communication plan and strategy to get over the crisis. It started, it called it Operation Chocolates, and what it did was it started with a print media campaign which did not yield much result. After some time, it invited the Bollywood superstar Amitabh Bachchan to do the talking on their behalf. But you have to understand one thing. If there's a crisis, what is that you have to tell the people? That how are you going to resolve it, or how it has been resolved. Communication can only do that much. So in the case of Cadbury's, so obviously first they denied that there could be any worms. They passed on the buck on the people, the retailers who were putting on the shelves, when they found that the stakeholder was very annoyed with them because they had been selling Cadbury's for so long. And the food department also entered on the scene, and they found that the packing was being done by hand, which means there was a possibility of worms getting into that. So obviously they had to look at the packaging of the chocolate before they could say that chocolate eating would be safe. So which is what they did. And then Amitabh Bachchan was shown, if you recall that ad, which is in the social media circuit also, you can always watch it, that he says that when Cadbury's guys came to him and said do their bidding, so he said could he go and see. So they show that Amitabh Bachchan is going to the factory. He's standing at the assembly line. He picks up a small piece of chocolate, eats and says, after all, it's a question of a faith or relationship with the brand for the last 50 years. So what it means that people also thought that obviously a company which is global in nature, which has given them smiles and happiness for so long, would not be doing it intentionally. So this could be an exception. And the empirical data tells us that within 6 months, the company was back to the normal, selling their chocolates all over the country. So the second principle which GRUNIG talks about, accountability principle. So when there's a crisis, an organization should accept responsibility for a crisis even if it was not its fault. Because when a crisis happens, it's very difficult to know what really caused that crisis, who could be possibly responsible for that. So it's important that when something happens in a factory or around the factory, so it is important that the company takes the responsibility and goes on with the response and rehabilitation. There's a very interesting case study from Johnson & Johnson, an American company, which happened in the early 1980s. They have a product, medicine called Tylenol, which is an analgesic product which you generally take in case you have fever or mild pain in the body. And one not too fine morning for the company, the Radio Chicago, if I remember correctly, announced that 6 people were dead after taking Tylenol. Now imagine, Tylenol is something which is over-the-counter drug. You don't need a doctor's prescription, and it's possible that thousands of people could be taking Tylenol at any given time. And this company had factories producing Tylenol at a number of places. So the first and foremost thing on the mind of the company was that 6 should not become 60, 600 or 6,000. So it's very important for them, to see that there were no more deaths. So whatever they had at their disposal, the communication channels and all, they just informed that please stop taking Tylenol, 6 people are feared dead, we are investigating. So their adversaries thought that it's a death knell for them, they are accepting the crisis. But the public interest is very important when a crisis happens. People are going to forgive you in case you have public interest in your mind, despite the fact you could have been responsible for a crisis, but people will never forgive you. The public opinion will not spare you in case you try to evade, avoid and pass on the buck. This should not happen. So nobody really got to know who really caused that crisis in J&J. Probably they knew that it was a sabotage in one batch, in one factory. But during that time when this investigation was going on, Johnson & Johnson had a group of people, troubleshooters, which included people, the lawmakers, included pharmacists, included people from the public domain. So the only thing was they wanted to find was that it can happen tomorrow also. And not only with J&J, with any company. So they came out with a law, which most of us did not know till we read the case study, which became a universal law globally. The law which the Congress first passed in the USA became a kind of a law all over the world by pharma companies. And what was the law? The law was that henceforth all medicines will come in tamper-proof packaging. I'm sure you'd have seen that when you are buying something, tablets, even it costs just 10 rupees, it comes in a foil, generally aluminum foil. You don't get any medicine loose. So imagine a crisis was turned into an opportunity. But opportunity should not be for the selfish interest. It should be in the interest of the public. Then people are going to appreciate. And you would have guessed it, that the share of the company which should have gone down, but when people thought that here was a company which was bothered about the public interest, the lives of the people, the share of the company went up in about 6 months to 1 year's time. So it's very important that if you feel yourself accountable, you share your problems with the public also responds equally well. The third principle GRUNIG talks about is the disclosure principle. When a crisis happens, one really does not know what caused it, what really happened, what is the extent of the crisis. But whenever you have facts and figures, it's important for you to disclose this to the people per se, and especially those who were affected by a crisis. If not immediately, but as soon as you have enough information to disclose. If you don't disclose, what happens? There are a lot of people on the other side. There could be adversaries, there could be your competitors, there could be people inside your companies were too willing, too happy to see that you don't get a good reputation. And media also would like, in case you create a communication vacuum, media would like to go to the people who may be unauthorized, people who because they would like to know the other side of the story, and it would be erroneous for the company in case it creates a public vacuum or allows grapevine gossips to emerge if you do not. So if you do not share, obviously that vacuum is filled in by grapevine and unauthorized communication, which will be at the risk and cost of the company which is facing the crisis. The fourth and final principle he talks about is symmetrical communication. GRUNIG has done a lot of work on symmetrical and asymmetrical communication. So in a crisis, in symmetrical means that you must put yourself in the shoes of the other. So must treat everyone equally. There's no adversary in symmetrical principle. In asymmetrical principle, there's a management and labor, it's a binary. But when you are putting to use the symmetrical principle, so which means that you are treating the other person equally. So in a crisis, the public interest should be considered as of equal importance to the organization's intent. So intent is equivalent to public interest in a crisis communication. If these two match, there's no question that your reputation can be damaged. But when your intention is selfish, your intention is to concoct or just try and do an eyewash, people get to know. And I always say that truth has this uncanny character of surfacing one day or the other. So in a crisis, truth has to be seen not just as a matter of ethics, but also the matter of strategy and also your core value of your company. Moving on from the communication principles propounded by James GRUNIG, let's now go to the message action plan, which is the forte of public relations. So from the perspective of PR, the message action plan in a crisis should include the following: public's message elements, communication techniques, responsibilities, time and schedule commitments, and accountability factors. What is that the people want to know? People want to know if something has happened, how we are going to resolve, if there's any rehabilitation required, where do they go, what is that they expect. If you recall, when we had the COVID-19 crisis, and nobody probably imagined that we'd be in for yet another crisis within the COVID, which was the reverse migration of lakhs of workers from the metropolitan towns, especially Delhi, Mumbai, some southern towns like Bangalore, back to their villages because there was a lockdown. They lost their jobs, they lost their the roof on their head because these people were very on the fringes of the society, very poor. So this became yet another crisis. It's very important that depending on the magnitude of the crisis, the stakeholders involved, the people in charge of communication, the authorities, depending on is the government, is the disaster management authority or the NGOs. So you would have realized, because very recent crisis, you all have seen that the first and foremost thing was that people who are out on roads, who lost their livelihood, they must be given food. Food became a very important consideration about messages, and you found that not only the government, the state government, the central government, the gurudwaras, the NGOs, and you also found the media was also trying to get donations from people. First and foremost was that. And then came the crisis that people who were living 15, 20, 150 to 1500 kilometers from where they were moving away, and they started they started moving on foot because there were no transports during the lockdown period. Then someone realized, within the governments, because the media started covering the plights of these migrant workers. Then you found that special trains were organized. You found some good Samaritans started, sending people by buses, by trucks, by so on and so forth. So it's very important, depending on what the crisis is, your message has to be according to that. And what technique are you going to use, what media are you going to use, what are the responsibilities, whom to call, where to call, are there any toll-free numbers, how to reach out to them. All these are important parts of a crisis message action plan after you have put into practice the crisis plan. So following are critical in a crisis situation. The enormity of the disaster, loss of human life. It is said that public opinion, swings like a pendulum when human life is involved. If there's no human life, disaster, people, it is not in the memories of people. It is when you see people dying, the faces of the people who are suffering, who have been part of the accident. That is what doesn't move away from the public memory, and that is what becomes a very important consideration for the reputation of the people who are in charge of handling the crisis. Then perceived abettors and victims, who possibly is responsible for creating that crisis and who are the victims. And perception about the crisis. It is said in the communication parlance that perceptions are probably more real than reality. Perceptions may be totally wrong. Perceptions may be just based on emotion. So it's very important on the part of the crisis managers, be it government, be it the company, to pick up those perceptions, see whether they're based on reality or not. If they're not based on reality, it's very important for them to use communication to change, to reverse the perceptions, because from perceptions they become opinions, from opinions they become convictions, from convictions they become volitions, and once they become volitions, it's very difficult to change. So perceptions have to be handled at embryonic stage, when they've just started when people have started having those perceptions in their minds. Based on those perceptions and media's own understanding of the situation, media often takes a stand. And unfortunately, in today's time, we find media generally is ideologically divided. So they take a stand based on what is their ideology, or sometimes commercial interests also. The game of TRPs, the more sensational they make, the more people going to watch. And I'm sure you have seen what happened in COVID crisis, or what happened in the farmers crisis, which is still going on as we talk in March 2021. So if you, as a communication person, as a crisis person, whether you're a student or whether you're handling, it's very important for you to track these crises through the media, images, through the media narrative. If you understand that and you see that there's not one kind of narrative, you also understand the currents, the dynamism, and when you start working, you know what media to use, what kind of strategy to use, and how to avoid sensationalism, and what is that you must do beyond the mass media. A number of empirical studies tell us that the websites of the companies, the websites of the government, the social media is frequented by the media people and other people. So maybe it's not necessarily that you have to go to the newspapers and TV, the formal methods of communication with the media to reach out to your public. Probably you could think about putting your press releases, putting your small piece to camera, putting small videos on your website also. And when you put it on the website, you would find that a number of people, would reach there, and the media would also take that input from your websites, because they may believe it or not, but because you are giving a perspective, it is from horse's mouth, and it is the stand of the company, of the government, so they would always give that in their narrative, quoting your website or your press release. So two aspects are important from disaster manager's perspective: How do you respond to the victims? Two, are you communicating what you are doing, and how shall you rebound? I gave you the example of Johnson and Johnson, and you find that there are other, there are a number of other case studies. The terrorist attack, 9/11, 2001, then 2008 we had the Mumbai siege by the terrorists, and you found that I can quickly tell you that when the terrorist attack happened in 9/11, you did not find media per se sensationalizing it. This probably was one of the biggest terrorist strike of the century, but they had got their advisory from the government, because the more you sensationalize it, the more you create a havoc, the more you create a panic. Who is going to have the last laugh? The abettors of that crisis. So that was not to be done. And the other thing which I found, because I tracked that crisis, that media, especially some of the newspapers and the television channels, they stopped running advertisements for about a week or so. Why did they do it? Now in advertisements, we generally have happy people making fun, enjoying themselves, happy-go-lucky guys, smiling, singing. Now that narrative would be in contrast to the narrative about so many deaths and destruction. So they didn't want to be seen as heartless, be seen as indifferent. So they withdrew it for a while. I recall Time magazine brought out a special issue without a single advertisement. And we saw the 26/11/2008 Mumbai siege, and we found that it was free for all. Nobody knew who was in charge, neither the state government nor the central government. And you found, hundreds of media guys with their cameras and all. They were outside the Taj Hotel. And imagine if a couple of grenades were thrown on them. Imagine what would have happened. So it was absolutely chaos, a very badly handled crisis communication. And what the media was covering, the bosses in Pakistan were taking cues from the media coverage and passing it on to the people, though terrorists were holed in the hotels. So it's very important that in a crisis situation, the kind of crisis, number one, you don't lose your reason. Two, you have to come up with a plan immediately. And too many cooks often spoil the broth. Somebody has to be a one-window approach to handle a crisis. So, role of media in a crisis. News media, especially in democracy, has a watchdog's role. So it brings into focus, public focus, issues with various perspectives. There are questions about those who are allegedly responsible. There are questions about those who are supposed to manage the crisis and look after the survivor and the victims. And media generally, is seen as an adversary by the authorities who handle the crisis. In the beginning, while they are giving, especially in the time of mitigation and preparedness, a lot of research tells us that media's role is really appreciated. But the moment they start showing holes in the, handling a crisis, and you find that generally the authorities become very adverse to what the media is doing. And that is where the problem arises in crisis communication. You have one narrative from the authority, you have different narrative from the media, and it does not make the people any wiser. There are too many kinds of narratives. So it's very important that the narrative, if not necessarily same, but the authorities have to take media on board. Like it or not, even if there's some criticism, and authorities do not have to see their report card, what media writes, based on what media writes. While you're handling a crisis, handle it to the best of your capacity. And let media write whatever they want to write. Truth surfaces at the end of the crisis. Take a call. How did you do it? Media cannot be your report card holder in times of crisis. So in part one of crisis communication, we looked at various kinds of crises. We looked at various kinds of phases in a crisis. We spoke about GRUNIG's communication principle in times of crisis. And we also looked at the message action plan and the communication plan. So in the second part, we'll talk more about media intrusion and also the image repair theory in crisis communication. So thanks for watching. I hope it made sense.